For today's video, we're going to be looking at 7 things that you can kind of think about when you're playing against a Vyse. This video is not necessarily a guide itself, as not everybody has unlocked Vyse, but this is for anybody that right now wants to find out little things that you can do to kind of counter Vyse and maybe kind of playing against the Vyse. I'm going to be kind of showing you some of the things that a Vyse might do or think about when you're playing against the Vyse. So just consider that while you're watching this video. This is not a guide. A guide will be put out in the future once I kind of learn a little bit more about the climbing journey and as more pros play her. We're going to be talking about a couple things. First of all, I'm going to be giving you tips based on the abilities. So I'm going to be doing an ability breakdown and then just sort of a tip that you can use to counter that ability or something to think about that ability. And then some final tips to sort of kind of top off everything else that's kind of remaining about the character. We're going to be looking at how they like to set up and how they like to play their utility. So that out of the way, let's get started. First things first, again, I need to announce I'm taking more students. If you're somebody that is interested in a one-on-one program, I am offering that. And the way that it works is simply you get 2 sessions for a month. And basically, you're going to be having a conversation back and forth with me. There's going to be 2 live sessions that can range between whatever your schedule is. You know, maybe you want a 30-minute session, maybe an hour session, we can do that. But what is important is that you are going to be able to talk with me for, 24 hours straight. Okay, so whatever it is that you need to talk about, I'll be there and I'll be able to walk you through anything. If you're in the middle of a ranked game and you need advice, I can help you out with that. Like, there's just a lot of things that we can do. Okay, the last student that I had actually very recently went from Diamond 2 to a 7-1. So really happy about him. I'm super proud. So if you are somebody that's kind of looking to kind of make that extra, that next step, we can kind of help you with that. All right, let's get started with the actual tips. First things first, when we're looking at the character itself, Vyse, she's a sentinel. So that means that there's a couple of things that we need to consider. And that is that, because they're not a duelist, they're not going to be the ones that are going to be entering site. And because they're not a controller or initiator, they're not going to be the ones that have to really combo off of things. But that's where it gets a little bit weird. Her abilities are incredibly good at synergizing with both controllers and duelists, making her some sort of sentinel initiator hybrid, with obviously the sentinel taking the primary role. The fact that she has a flash allows her to have a lot of solo play potential. So whenever you're playing against a Vyse, there's always the possibility of that flash existing, considering that it doesn't go away. Maybe later in the patch, we'll see something like maybe it'll be going away for longer, or maybe just in general, the flash will disappear, a la Chamber. So we'll see things kind of change back and forth, but for now, very strong and very good at dealing with a lot of aggressive players. And that's where most of the setups kind of come in. We're going to talk about the setups that are really strong against aggressive plays, and really just kind of like all out pushing plays and people that are kind of running out onto site. So these are the types of characters that Vyse likes to counter. So if you've kind of learned a little bit about dealing with deadlock, we kind of have the same idea going on when it comes to Vyse. When it comes to the cons, well, if you're dealing with someone that's good at the game or a little bit more competent, the utility is going to feel a little lackluster due to how easy it is to shoot. And then there's other things like, for example, the utility has to be manually activated all the way through except for the wall. And they have very little info gathering and they can be easily shot down, meaning that once it comes down to all of it, even the ultimate may feel lackluster due to the fact that maybe the opponent has something like a sheriff or something like that. Okay, so just be very mindful of these little characteristics when you're playing against this character. These pros and cons might change. This is just, first impressions. They've been out for a little bit now. The PvE, this is how they were, right? So I just kind of want to see how everything goes on from there. But this is them right now. Let's talk about the abilities. The first thing is the flash. The flash is kind of interesting as it can go through walls. The thing about it is that if you're somebody that likes to play Sentinel, they're going to feel right at home, as the flash does have a little bit of preparation time. However, as it is being prepared, the flash can't be shot. Once the flash is out, however, I'm pretty sure you can't shoot it. I haven't seen anyone being able to do that. I don't think that's a possibility. Once the flash is out, it is out. However, this means that you need to start relying a little bit more on sound cues and being able to kind of work with the delay of the character. So for example, the delay before the flash means that you need to kind of start paying attention with how you're comboing with the space and the controller that you're playing with. So for example, a Vyse might try to push and try to take this backside on C, maybe on Haven, and we'll try to use the flash to kind of flash this back area like a breach. Well, because of the delay, the character might not be able to use the flash, meaning that they're not going to really be able to kind of make this work. However, Once a duelist and maybe an initiator has taken all of this space, you can actually use this space to then use that ability for a good post plant. And this is where most of that flash kind of comes in. The flash is going to be really good at coordinating either with the delay of somebody else, or maybe with the noise of somebody else. Maybe a lot of like noise is happening, a lot of visual clutter. Then they can activate their ability. But most of the time, they're going to be useful in either positions where they need to control a choke, like you see up here, or they can be used in conjunction with maybe like a smoke hiding that flash. So maybe, for example, you can have an Omen maybe do a one-way over here, and then you can set up your flash a little bit ahead of time. So whenever you're ready to push, you now have an extra flash to sort of push into this area. So whenever you're fighting against a Vyse, my tip and advice for you is to pay attention to either those smokes that might seem a little bit out of place. They might be preparing a Vyse. And number two, make sure that when you're playing against that retake, that flash is not going to go away. So they're probably going to have a setup for one of the chokes. CT is the most prevalent, so be very careful when you're coming from CT. If you're coming from other areas, like for example, garage, maybe on A side ascent, you're coming in from tree, it might not be as important to you, but it is something to consider. Last but not least, because it gives information that makes it really powerful on post plant. So I want you guys to be very cautious about that sort of stuff, okay? So with that out of the way, that's basically the ability. Be very cautious when using it and playing against it. The next one is Shear. Shear is very weird in terms of how the ability works. It is indestructible once it activates. Once somebody crosses, it's going to be really difficult to kind of play against it. So characters like Jet or Raze that like to go in will have an easy time tripping this wall. However, the wall is not super long, so it's kind of a wall that's really useful against, like, for example, choke areas, or they're really good at like kind of pushing and separating the team. So make sure that you're kind of looking into these choke heavy strongholds. So for example, Abyss is one of those prime examples of choke heavy like maps. And these choke heavy maps, especially the one on A, is going to seem very difficult to fight against simply due to the fact that the wall will just completely separate your team if you're not fast enough. So there's a slight delay after someone crosses. So if your entire team pushes together, there's no problem there. But of course, there's going to be something else in touch with that. This is the only ability that will self-activate. That means that normally the wall is going to be a trigger for a bigger play. So what's going to happen is whenever you see a wall and you don't really know where it is and your team wants to push together, be very mindful of either A, making sure that you're sending either the weakest player first, and by that I mean maybe the one with 10 HP first, or the duelist that is self-sufficient, maybe a Jet that can kind of smoke themselves down. Why? Because if your team is not ready to coordinate or push, there's always going to be a second play that happens right after. Maybe, for example, there's a flash and they're going to act off of that flash. And I'm going to talk about that in just a second. Sorry, I'll talk about that later. There's other things that you have to also consider. Whenever you're going to have someone crossing this wall, there also could be something like the razor wire that might potentially cause more harm for your team. So these are things to also consider. So the wall itself is going to be a trigger for something else. Okay, the wall itself is not going to be the problem. So your job is to use this piece of information against them. So one thing that I have for you in terms of this tip is to actually jump peek around common wall locations. So I've shown you, for example, two right here. Potentially once the actual guide comes out, or the more experience you get, or as you play a game against the Vyse, you'll start paying attention to where the walls normally are. Some of them are a lot harder to counter than others. So for example, if someone walls off hookah, that one's a lot harder to kind of counter. So your team either has to be ready to just sort of push all in, or be able to split and potentially have the other choke already controlled by B-Long. So if your team is not ready to push all together, try to bait it out. Jump peeking around it is actually a really strong way of just kind of getting it out, as there's a slight delay. So jump peek around the corner, try to see if you can get the wall, and if not, try to deal with those split plays. When it comes to Razorvine, Razor Wire I called it, it's kind of weird. A lot of people will treat it as a molly as it damages you, but there's a couple attributes that you need to consider. Number one, it does not damage you if you're not moving. So if you're standing still, it won't damage you. Number two, it acts more as a slow than it is a molly. So a lot of players will see the molly on the floor and will think that they're kind of not able to push any forward. That's not necessarily the case. You actually can still push. However, Razorvine is usually a sign for something else. And normally this is where I talked about just how impactful they can be when they are paired up with other controllers. And this is why. And a lot of the times controllers tend to be really good at holding chokes and being really strong for delay. So for example, Brim is a prime example of how good they are for delay. So something like Razorvine is going to be really good at controlling the choke and not only delaying the push, but also potentially allowing for rotations to be a little bit more seamless. When it comes to this character, I need you guys to not put too much mind into the Razorvine when it is out, as the damage that it gives you is actually not that powerful. And we're going to talk about how slow it is for it to kill you, but it's not really something that should be primarily on your mind. Just think about it as a slow, like a Sage slow, as I can promise you, it is not going to be the reason you're going to die. It is actually the person that's going to swing right after. The counter to something like this is kind of in touch with everything else. The Razorvines themselves are not going to activate by themselves just as is. Usually there's another trigger. So for example, you're going to notice that either A, they can be used on attack and they can be used to fully control an entire lane so they can kind of deter the opponent. But like we just talked about, it might not necessarily be the only thing that we have, right? You want to combine it with a smoke and other things. They can also be really useful for maybe slowing them down when somebody pushes up. There's really not a lot that you can do when it comes to what happens once they're already activated. But again, don't pay too much mind. The impact comes from someone swinging it. If you want to counter these types of things, you got to be ready with how easy they are to shoot. They're really easy to spot. You just got to make sure that you're playing against that wall and you're paying attention to how slow you're pushing. Slow rotation, slow pushes, defaults are going to be really strong at dealing with sentinels, and Vyse is no exception. Last but not least, the skill of this character will improve the more lineups you know. As we talked about, these things right here are not very easy to deploy while the push is happening, but if you're able to sort of create a push with your team and coordinate this type of push, this is going to be a lot stronger and it's going to be a lot easier to deal with. Okay, in order for you to counter these things though, I want you guys to keep in mind that if you pay too much respect to the fact that you are under a Razorvine, you're going to die. Okay, the damage that it does, it's not that much. I promise you, you'll be able to still fight, but you should still try to make it your job to get out if you can get out. And if not, try to fight if you can. But the Razorvine will not be the reason you die. So the ultimate is kind of weird. So the first thing I noticed about it is that it has the same radius and same activation circle and yada yada as KJ. So if you're someone that likes to play KJ, you're going to feel right at home when it comes to the activation positions and where exactly it is that you can use them. There's going to be a lot more maps that are going to be releasing that have a lot more synergy. So Pearl is really strong for characters like KJ as the setup and the radius is really good. And so is going to be maps like Split. As you can see, a map over here like Haven already has a pretty good activation spot for KJ, and you're going to see that is the exact same radius. I just had to move it a little bit to the left so you can see the difference between the two. They're pretty much the same. Okay. However, in order for you to counter an ability that destroys your primary weapon for a moment is to look at eco weapons. One of the things that I've kind of paid attention to is the Deagle, and I've always told my students that if you're going to rank up, you have to learn to use the Deagle. The Deagle is going to be one of the more powerful components in your counter, but if you're somebody that has abilities that are lethal, so for example, if you save your Razult for a push that has an ultimate with Vyse, you're going to be able to counter that push no problem. Any lethal ability, so for example, anything in Chamber's kit is going to be very good at kind of bringing him up. I know we did a tier list and I put him down below, but this might actually bring him up just a tad, just because he's going to be a little bit more viable at dealing with Vyse comps. Other things to also consider are just simply things like knives, right? A lot of mobility is going to be really strong at dealing with the fact that people don't have their primary. So the counterplay is going to be mostly eco-related. If you see that they have like an ult, buy a Deagle. If you don't really have the money for it, try to kind of pay attention to any other lethal abilities that you may have, and maybe consider buying shorties around chokes if you think that they're going to be fully pushing onto a site. When it comes to defense, there's really not much to say. Most of the time they're going to be retake related, so you're going to probably be under the influence of this ult. So when that happens, just try to pay attention to the chokes and try to pay attention to making sure that you're trading. There's really not much to say there as of right now. What about further tips? Other things to consider, right, is that when the setup is happening, we're going to notice that there's a lot of things, there's a lot of moving parts when you're paying attention to Vyse's setup. And we talked about the wall as a trigger. So one of the things we noticed here is that, for example, in this position, Jett likes to trigger the wall, and this way they're able to identify where the flash is. If you are someone that is not paying attention to where the wall is or where the flash is, they're going to have a really easy position where they can kind of restructure their entire setup on the fly. I believe that it's 20 seconds to be able to kind of recover your flash and being able to use it again. It might be 10 seconds. I believe that it was increased from PvE. So I think it's 20 seconds. And the way that it works is simply like this. Once the flash has been activated, they can actually pick it back up and they can use it to restructure their play. So for example, if everybody's already delayed here because they activated the wall and you can't use the flash, they're going to be able to kind of pick up that flash and use it for more aggressive plays, like maybe for example using it right here and kind of getting anybody as they're going to be swinging off of it. Okay, so make sure that you're paying attention to those choke heavy maps, for example, like Seaside on Haven or A side or B side. Both of these two are really good on Ascent. Both of these two sites over here on Abyss are also really strong. So maps like that are going to benefit Vyse really well. So make sure you're paying attention to the moving parts. If you're able to draw at the wall, most of her utility is going to feel a little bit weaker because she has to have some sort of contact. She can't play contact without her wall. So she has to make sure that either she's playing with somebody else, meaning that you drew rotations, or make sure that you're paying attention to that choke itself, as they really don't have a lot of possibilities of making more impact without it. So again, pay attention to the moving parts, and the main thing is that shear. If you're able to draw out that shear, you're going to be fine, and that's already half the utility already nullified. Everything else will become a little bit easier and simpler to fight against once that wall is down. So again, Vyse needs to use two pieces of utility normally together to stay strong, and normally they will act off of that shear. So pay attention to that when you're playing against a Vyse. So we talked about this before. Thorns don't kill, they slow. So once you are under, maybe for example, an area where the thorns are going to be in, or maybe you're pushing and you didn't get a chance to get those thorns, most of the time people tend to panic, and I've seen this a bunch now, where people are kind of looking for the vines, or they're trying to move away from the vine location, and they're not really paying too much attention to where they're aiming at. Your main counter is to kind of think about the impact that someone will have off of the swing. So if you are under a vine, you're still going to take some damage. You're going to potentially take like 10 points of damage. As it is actually not that powerful. So you're going to see right now that I hit one of these bots for 3 bullets in the chest, meaning that they had 40 HP. It took me 2 of them to be able to fully get them, to die. It didn't really, it doesn't feel like much testing here, but you're not going to really kill someone off of the thorns, and that's the same thing that's going to happen against the opponent. The opponent is not going to die to thorns. You are not going to die to thorns. Don't give these things respect. The problem comes from the swing. So if you're in a position where you get hit by the thorns, be paying close attention to where someone could be sitting close to you. If you're in a position, for example, right here, where you are maybe, for example, by Jen, you could potentially be dealing with 2 angles, so this becomes a lot more problematic, right? But in a position where you are over here in heaven, you're safe. I wouldn't really put too much thought into it, right? The thorns aren't going to kill you. I find that this is where people tend to panic. They're in slow, they're getting damaged, and they kind of freak out. Again, this is just mostly for the average player. If you're more competent, you're very likely to predict these thorns. Last but not least, I mentioned this before, Flash is her only source of information. And because of that, you're going to find a lot of similarities between the Flash and cam locations. So for example, over on B, we have a really popular cam location over here at the top by this elbow area. This is one of the main areas where Vyse can use the Flash, not only for players that are coming out of, let's say, for example, over here by Hookah, being able to catch them off guard, but also being able to catch opponents that might be long. Like we mentioned, the Flash does give information when it flashes someone. So if you're able to get this piece of utility out, and you're able to kind of take it out before they're able to either A, get some sort of utility out, or B, maybe after the Flash is out, you're able to kind of move away from it, you're going to be able to call for rotations, and you're going to be able to sort of draw out a lot of different things from the opponent. Vyse can only deal with unprepared aggressive teams. So if you're able to deal with the cam, quote unquote, and you're able to deal with sort of the Flash early, you're going to be able to make more of an impact on the push, as they only have that racer wire that we talked about. And against a strong team, Vyse can't really do anything. If you're kind of blocking off her positions where she can swing with maybe like a nade, and maybe you're blocking off positions where she can kind of try to act off of her razor wire, without a flash, she really has nothing. So being able to shoot the flash and preemptively kind of hit it around areas where the camps normally hide, if you're a Cypher player, you're going to be a perfect counter for places like these. So kind of look out for these positions and, you know, kind of try to look out for where the flash normally is in your rounds when you're playing the game, as it is going to be a lot more important to shoot it down than anything else. Drawing out the wall might seem a little bit tricky in positions like we mentioned here on Hookah, but the flash, it's still a really crucial piece of information for someone like Vyse. So just shooting it down is going to provide a lot more question marks for Vyse to kind of deal with, and it's going to provide a lot more trouble for Vyse, so they can't swing off of their utility, making them more useless. So as long as you have that in mind, you're going to easily be able to counter Vyse. Just keep the flash in mind. So some final thoughts just before we close it off. I think the character is well-rounded, a lot of solo play potential. If you're someone that likes to climb and you're able to talk to your controllers, duelists, and maybe even act off of as an initiator hybrid, you're going to be able to make a huge impact, which is something that a lot of Sentinels tend to struggle with. If you're someone that plays a more supportive role, you're going to struggle a little bit more in climbing. And I feel like that's really common as you're kind of waiting for the team to make an impact, and you yourself are kind of giving them that utility, so you're not going to feel like that impact comes from you. But with characters that have flashes, like we've seen with Omen, or characters that have some sort of offensive utility like Clove, you're going to be seeing a lot more impact. So due to the way that Vyse is kind of like structured, with no flank watch utility, but more on the front line trying to help the team, I feel like you're going to be making more impact on site takes. Just be very, very mindful of how they draw out your utility. Okay, and that's it. That's it for the class. I'm going to be opening up the question period. Don't forget to comment and subscribe if you have any questions or if you watch this in full. I do appreciate it. All right, we're done here.